Good afternoon. Thank you, Jonathan, for such a generous introduction. I do have to say, I think the critical Buddhism essay was one of the better things I've done, so it means a lot to me that you found it valuable. I'd like to thank my colleagues in the religion department for choosing me as this year's Danforth speaker, an unexpected honor and a marvelous opportunity. And I especially want to thank everyone for being here today. I know it's a hectic and demanding time of year. In the early 1270s, Japan's military government, the Bakufu, or shogunate, was preparing for war. The great Mongol Empire, having conquered Song China and the Korean peninsula, had turned its sights toward Japan. As troops moved west to man the coastal barriers, shogunal officials sought to bolster Japan's defenses against foreign invaders by quelling unruly elements at home. In the course of that effort, the dissident priest Nichiren was arrested and sentenced to exile on the bleak island of Sado in the Sea of Japan. By Nichiren's own account, however, a tacit decision was made to do away with him. Under cover of night, he was taken to the execution grounds at a place called Tatsunokuchi, which literally means the dragon's mouth. The attempted beheading failed, it is said, when a shining object suddenly shot across the sky, terrifying his would-be executioners. This incident is known as the Tatsunokuchi persecution. For more than 700 years, Nichiren's extraordinary escape has been celebrated in hagiographies, kabuki plays, woodblock prints, paintings, novels, manga, and movies. Not only by Nichiren Buddhist practitioners, but also by others who have admired Nichiren as a Japanese cultural hero. But since the late 19th century, scholars both outside and within the Nichiren Buddhist sect have disputed its historicity. Spoiler alert, I will not be taking sides in that debate or offering pronouncements on what really happened. Rather, I approach the controversy in terms of my own long-standing interests in the modern reception of pre-modern Buddhist traditions and how contemporary values and assumptions shape our readings of past events. Recent scholarly treatments of Nichiren's seemingly miraculous escape from death illuminate larger patterns in Buddhist modernism and in the hermeneutic shifts that occur when medieval accounts are assessed by modern critical standards. They also raise questions about what responsibility the historian of religion bears in analyzing a tradition's foundational narratives. My talk today is in 3 parts. First, I will introduce Nichiren and his personal account of how he escaped beheading. Second, I'll touch on 3 phases in modern debates over the historicity of this episode: the nature of the evidence, textual and astronomical, adduced on both sides, and the impact of the controversy on modern scholarly accounts of Nichiren's life. Lastly, I consider the episode itself as a mythic narrative that, whatever its status as historical fact, encodes core teachings and principles of the Nichiren Buddhist tradition. For those of you familiar with the Zen master Dogen or the Pure Land teacher Shinran, whom Jonathan just mentioned, Nichiren was roughly contemporary with them, although he has drawn far less attention in Western Buddhist studies. Nichiren's followers, which came to take his name, is today one of Japan's largest Buddhist traditions, comprising some 40 officially incorporated religious bodies, including temple lineages and lay organizations. Nichiren taught exclusive devotion to the Lotus Sutra, a scripture revered throughout East Asia for its promise of universal Buddhahood. Buddhist discourse of Nichiren's time held that the world had entered a degenerate era known as Mappo, the last age of the Dharma, or teaching, when the Buddha's message becomes obscured and liberation extremely difficult to achieve. Nichiren maintained that now in this evil age, all other teachings had lost their efficacy. Only the Lotus Sutra was profound and powerful enough to lead all beings to enlightenment. He advocated a form of Lotus Sutra practice accessible to all, chanting the sutra's daimoku, or title, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, in that mantric formula. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, that chant is said to contain the virtues of the entire sutra and indeed all Buddhist teachings within itself. Nichiren belongs to the East Asian branch of the Mahayana, or Great Vehicle tradition, and he shared its understanding of the cosmos as a non-dual, interpenetrating whole in which each particular phenomenon, without losing its own identity, simultaneously pervades and encompasses all others. This non-dual interpenetration of all things provides the ontological ground for the realization of Buddhahood by ordinary persons and for the non-discriminating compassion of the bodhisattva that sees another's suffering as one's own. It also accounts for ritual efficacy, as it explains the mechanism of what is called stimulus and response, or kanno doko in Japanese, by which individuals' devoted practice is said to elicit numinous responses from Buddhas, bodhisattvas, or the cosmos itself. Nichiren saw the Lotus Sutra as the perfect expression of non-dual reality, and his reading has a strong social dimension. As faith in the Lotus Sutra spread, he taught this present world would become transformed into an ideal Buddha land. Conversely, Nichiren saw rejection of the lotus in his day in favor of incomplete, lesser teachings as the root cause of Japan's present hardships: drought, famine, earthquakes, epidemics, and the Mongol threat. He was relentless in his criticism of other Buddhist forms, such as Pure Land and Zen, and of government officials for supporting them. In consequence, he was repeatedly attacked and was twice arrested and exiled. The only contemporaneous account of Nichiren's near beheading appears in a letter he himself wrote to a follower about 4 years after the fact. It's long, so I'll summarize the relevant part. Nichiren was arrested on the 12th day of the 9th month, 1271, in the town of Kamakura, where the Bakufu was headquartered. His guards led him along the main avenue, where they reached the shrine of the god Hachiman, a protector of Buddhism and the tutelary deity of the ruling shogunal house. There, Nichiren insisted on dismounting, assuring his captors that he wished only to say his last words to the deity. But he proceeded to deliver a startling rebuke. "Hachiman," he cried, "are you really a god?" He reminded the deity that, as described in the Lotus Sutra, all gods had vowed in the Buddha's presence to protect its devotees. "If I die tonight," he said, "I will immediately report to Shakyamuni Buddha that you, Hachiman, failed to honor your oath. If you think that will go hard with you, you'd better do something." Exiting Kamakura, the party proceeded along the shore toward the beach where criminals were executed. One imagines an eerie procession in the dead of night, broken only by the sound of waves and the flickering of pine torches. En route, Nichiren sent word to one of his lay followers, the warrior Shijo Yorimoto, who lived nearby. Yorimoto came running together with his 3 brothers, resolved to die with Nichiren. Eventually, they reached the execution site, and Yorimoto wept, saying, "These are your last moments." Nichiren chided him gently and declared that no joy could be greater than to give one's life for the Lotus Sutra. Just then, and I quote, "A brilliant orb, hikarimono, as bright as the moon, burst forth, shooting across the sky from southeast to northwest. It was shortly before dawn and still too dark to see anyone's face, but the radiant object illuminated everyone like bright moonlight. Blinded, the executioner fell prostrate. The warriors panicked. Some ran off into the distance, some dismounted and huddled on the ground, and others crouched in their saddles. I called out, 'Here, why do you shrink from this vile prisoner? Come closer. You should hurry up and behead me before day breaks, or it will be a gruesome sight.' But no one would approach." Nichiren was then exiled to Sado Island in accord with the official sentence, where he would spend about 2.5 years. He himself regarded the foiled execution as a death and transformation. A few months later, he wrote to his followers, "On the 12th day of the 9th month of last year, a person called Nichiren was beheaded. This is his spirit that has come to Sado province and is writing this amid the snow as a memento to his close disciples." In fact, the incident at Tatsunokuchi marked a turning point in his life and thought. In exile, enduring cold, hunger, and the hostility of the locals, Nichiren wrote some of his most important works and developed his mature teachings. Nichiren's first-hand account of the attempted beheading, from which I quoted, appears in a personal letter dated around 1275. By then, he had been reprieved from exile, entered a life of reclusion, and was reflecting back on his career. The letter is called Shuju on Furumai Gosho. It's literally something like on various deeds. This on character here is an honorific. So we know that this title was supplied not by Nichiren, but by someone else in the process of cataloging Nichiren's writings after his death. The original, unfortunately, was lost in a fire in 1875. Medieval hagiographies would elaborate on its already dramatic account, asserting, for example, that the sword had shattered in the executioner's hand. And this detail is often reproduced in visual depictions, as you see. It represents an attempt to align Nichiren's experience with a passage in the Lotus Sutra, which says that if anyone brandishing a sword should menace a lotus devotee, that sword shall at once be broken. By the 18th century, this particular element in the story had raised some skepticism, but the Tatsunokuchi incident itself was not yet questioned. Now, let's fast forward to the late 19th century, when Japan was struggling to establish itself as a modern nation. The new Meiji government had established a Bureau of Historiography, charged with compiling an official national history. Heading the project was one Dr. Shigeno Yasutsugu, a scholar of Chinese studies and among Japan's first professional historians. By the way, in Japanese, the surname is given first. A pioneer in adopting modern evidence-based historiographical methods, Shigeno was determined to rely solely on unimpeachable sources and to strip away legendary accretions. He had, for example, denied the historicity of certain epic battles and beloved samurai heroes appearing in Japan's medieval war tales. This positivist stance had earned him the epithet Dr. Erasure, or Masatsu Hakushi, or perhaps in today's parlance we could say Dr. Cancel. In searching for reliable primary sources, Shigeno was led to the archives of Honmanji, a prominent Nichiren Buddhist temple in Kyoto, where he found a brief letter in Nichiren's hand, dated just 2 days after his arrest, and addressed to his close lay disciple Toki Jonin, informing him of his imminent exile and urging him not to lose heart. In that letter, Nichiren voices regret that he had not yet been beheaded for the Lotus Sutra's sake, but says nothing explicit about an attempted execution or a miraculous escape. Based on this single text, Shigeno concluded that a death sentence had never been issued and that the entire episode had been fabricated by Nichiren's later followers. He published his argument in 1889 and also lectured on the topic to academic historical societies. Shigeno's assertion caused consternation among leaders of the various Nichiren Buddhist denominations. Among them was Tanaka Chingaku, a lay evangelist known for his role in promoting Nichiren Shugi, or Nichirenism, a lay Buddhist movement promoting a reading of Nichiren's teachings geared to a modernization and nation building. Tanaka was not quite 30 at the time, but he boldly sought and obtained a personal interview with the eminent Dr. Shigeno and brought along his own secretary to record it. Their exchange, which Tanaka later published, reveals a clash of incommensurable paradigms. Shigeno's argument essentially rested on 2 points. First, the lack of any extant document in Nichiren's hand referring to the mysterious shining object. And second, the fact that in Japan's medieval period, priests charged with serious crimes were usually not put to death, as the karmic retribution for killing a priest directly was to be feared. Instead, they were exiled, although that often had the same effect. Shigeno insisted that he was merely following the dictates of evidentiary scholarship and did not see why his stance should distress Nichiren Buddhists, who were free to believe whatever they wanted to. For Tanaka, however, given Shigeno's role in compiling Japan's official national history, his denial of the Tatsunokuchi persecution amounted to its erasure by state authority. Tanaka saw Nichiren's wondrous escape from death as the defining moment in his life, comparable to Christ's crucifixion, and confirming his identity as the teacher of the Lotus Sutra for the present Mappo era. And because Tanaka believed that Nichiren's teaching could elevate Japan to a position of world spiritual leadership, the erasure of this pivotal event, he said, would have dire consequences for the nation. Tanaka reproached Shigeno for not considering all the evidence. Other writings by Nichiren mention the failed beheading. Shigeno had merely to consult the archives of Nichiren Buddhist temples. He also objected to Shigeno's method of excluding from consideration all texts that did not survive in the author's own hand, as such works account for a preponderance of pre-modern writing. Original manuscripts, Tanaka noted, are vulnerable to fire, floods, and the general precarity of material objects. What status to accord texts that do not survive in Nichiren's holograph would in fact become a long-term issue in the Tatsunokuchi controversy. Unable to convince Shigeno in direct conversation, Tanaka proceeded to rebut his argument in a 5-hour lecture delivered in what was then Tokyo's largest public hall before some 2,000 or 3,000 people, including government ministers, scholars, and leading clerics. His talk galvanized the Nichiren sect and advanced Tanaka's own Nichirenist movement. But Shigeno's criticisms by no means disappeared. A second stage in the controversy took place over the first decades of the 20th century. Unlike Shigeno, a Confucian specialist, the critics this time were Buddhist scholars, although not of the Nichiren tradition. And they were intent on revising the history of Japanese Buddhism in rationalist and humanist terms. By then, modern printed editions of Nichiren's complete works had become readily available. And one thrust of the new critiques accordingly focused on Nichiren's personal account in various deeds. For example, Sakai no Koyo, a scholar of the Shin Buddhist school, blasted the work as, quote, a blatant forgery, a laughable production of later persons, unquote. It did not sound like Nichiren, he said. It was full of exaggerated descriptions, its tone was boastful, and its narrative was overly dramatic and included implausible, miraculous events. A concurrent line of attack questioned not Nichiren's authorship of the various deeds, but the veracity of its report. Representative was a 1938 study by the leftist Buddhist studies scholar Sakai Akio, who claimed to be liberating Nichiren from the constraints of sectarian hagiography. Sakio, like Shigeno before him, claimed that there had been no death sentence. The entire incident, he argued, was an illusion that took root in Nichiren's mind, and which Nichiren gradually reconstructed in memory to accord with his self-image as the teacher of the Lotus Sutra for the present age. It was then reified by later followers into a matter of historical fact. Here, Sakio wrote, we can glimpse either the workings of autosuggestion by a mind driven to extremity or the traces of a process of subsequent legend-making. The suggestion that Nichiren was an unreliable narrator of his own experience has persisted, with imaginative variations. More recent scholarly treatments have proposed, for example, that en route to deliver Nichiren into the custody of the Sado authorities, his escort paused to rest at the execution grounds, and Nichiren simply assumed that he was to be beheaded, or that the official in charge, one Hei no Yoritsuna, sought to intimidate him by pretending to prepare for a beheading, and Nichiren fell for the deception. Such suggestions can neither be verified nor disproven, but significantly, they are often presented as one of two alternatives. Either the account of Nichiren's escape from beheading, as set forth on various deeds, was created by later followers, or, whether produced consciously or otherwise, it was Nichiren's own misrepresentation. This binary, I argue, points to a deep-rooted and distinctly modern rationalist discomfort with the idea of a supernatural event and an inability to grasp it in any terms other than fabrication, if not by later followers, then by Nichiren himself. A third phase in the controversy emerged shortly before the Pacific War and still continues. Ironically, it was not launched by external critics, but arose and continues within the academic wing of Nichiren Buddhism, in the context of efforts by a small but vocal group of sectarian scholars embracing modern critical approaches similar to Shigeno's, with the aim of purifying the Nichiren canon. Nichiren wrote voluminously. More than 400 works are attributed to him, including personal letters, doctrinal essays, and other writings, and an astonishing 120 or so survive in his own hand, the originals. It's now generally acknowledged that some writings in this collection may be not Nichiren's, but the work of later disciples, produced and attributed to Nichiren after his death. Since the 1940s, successive voices within the Nichiren Buddhist studies world have called for the identification and sidelining of apocryphal texts. Only then, they argue, will Nichiren's true intent become clear. In theory, the project of identifying Apocrypha could shed considerable light on the early intellectual development of Nichiren Buddhism. Over time, however, this project has reified into a near obsession with authentic texts, a diminishing number of Nichiren attributed works that are deemed reliable, and a paralyzing hermeneutics of suspicion that considers only thoroughly unimpeachable writings as a window onto Nichiren's life and thought. While time will not permit a detailed critique, I myself am deeply skeptical of this endgame of a purified canon. In many cases, we simply cannot know for certain whether a given work is Nichiren's or not, and the criteria employed in judgment often rest in circular fashion on pre-assumptions about Nichiren's intent. There is also a failure to recognize that medieval concepts of authorship were often collaborative, and that religious traditions are not created in toto by their founders, but are shaped by generations of redactors and commentators. In this scholarly atmosphere, the various deeds holds an ambiguous position. Undeniably, an original once existed. But Nichiren wrote it on multiple sheets of paper, which shortly after his death became separated and were entered into early catalogs of his writing as 3 independent works. The ending was somehow also inadvertently switched with the ending of another letter. Not until the first critical edition of Nichiren's writings, published in 1876, was it available in its present form. The editor, the lay scholar Ogawa Taido, wrote that in reassembling on various deeds, he had thereby, quote, removed the cause for 1,000 years' regret, end quote. But even before his edition went to press, the original of various deeds, along with more than 20 others of Nichiren's handwritten manuscripts, went up in flames and can no longer be consulted. For some researchers, the checkered transmission history of On Various Deeds has raised suspicion that parts of it may be later interpolations. An aura of distrust now surrounds the entire work, which has in turn affected treatments of the Tatsunokuchi persecution in scholarly biographies of Nichiren over the last several decades. Let's look at a few examples. The late Tamura Yoshiro, a noted scholar of the Lotus Sutra and of Japanese Buddhist thought, wrote, On Various Deeds has traditionally been deemed a superbly crafted, eloquent autobiographical account, but it is a composite of 3 originally independent works, and that fact, along with its contrived dramatic effects and its grandiloquent recountings of miraculous happenings, has given rise to the theory that it is in part apocryphal. The question of authenticity needs to be investigated, and it may be said that the miracle at Tatsunokuchi does not go beyond the realm of legend. Other biographies elude the incident altogether. The next 2 examples come from prominent historians of Nichiren Buddhism. Takagi Yutaka writes, Nichiren was taken to the execution grounds, but fortunately, the beheading did not take place. Period. Nakao Takashi says, arriving at the execution grounds, they placed Nichiren in position to behead him and made as though to carry out the sentence. In the end, however, nothing happened, and with dawn, they departed. given the importance to Nichiren's later tradition of the account of his extraordinary escape from death, it might seem astonishing that an authoritative biography would not even mention it. This silence, I suggest, reflects a dilemma arising from the methodological limits of attempts to conclusively weed out legend from historical fact. If the luminous object that saved Nichiren's life is prejudged to be a legendary accretion, then one must question either the authenticity of those writings that describe it or Nichiren's own reliability as a narrator of events. Faced with that choice, it is perhaps not strange that silence would seem a reasonable option. I must say that Takagi and Nakao are primarily institutional historians whom I otherwise greatly respect and am much indebted to. For myself, however, as a historian of religion, glossing over the tradition of the luminous object in this fashion represents a failure of the historical imagination, a refusal both to enter the cognitive world of medieval Japan and to acknowledge what such an event might have meant to Nichiren and how the story of his escape has shaped the subsequent self-understanding of his tradition. The Tatsunokuchi story starts with Nichiren. It cannot be wholly a later interpolation. 3 writings attributed to him mention the shining object, and while those 3 have survived only as later transcriptions, several others, some in his own hand, speak of his near beheading. Did he embroider events? Quite possibly. Nichiren was a master storyteller. His recounting in letters to his followers of narrative episodes from Buddhist scriptures are far more vivid and detailed than their original versions. Nichiren was also widely read. He had access to early versions of Japan's first medieval war tales and incorporated their bombastic, self-aggrandizing narrative style into several of his writings. More significantly, he saw himself as the Buddha's envoy to the present age, and his self-representations are framed to convey that understanding. But before suggesting alternative ways of reading the Tatsunokuchi episode, let me introduce another aspect of the controversy. On the night of November 11th, 1953, persons in the Tokyo-Yokohama area observed what appeared to be a huge shooting star that passed overhead and then vanished with a loud report, having either exploded or fallen to earth. Newspapers carried eyewitness accounts. One reader with a long-standing interest in the Tatsunokuchi story was struck by the resemblance of those accounts to the description of the luminous object in Nichiren's various deeds, which he sent to one Dr. Hirose Hideo, an astronomer at the Tokyo Astronomical Observatory and professor of astronomy at Tokyo University. Intrigued, Hirose investigated and concluded that the bright object observed over Tokyo had been a meteor originating in the Taurid meteor shower associated with Enkei's comet, visible around late October by the modern calendar. Hirose also proposed that a meteor from this group, falling from the parent comet's orbit, had fortuitously saved Nichiren's life at Tatsunokuchi. Since then, other astronomers, such as Saito Kuniji, have endorsed Hirose's theory. And other explanations advanced for the mysterious object argue, for example, that it could have been a lightning flash or thunderbolt, a falling star, a fireball, ball lightning, or even, if we move outside academic circles, an alien spacecraft. I will bracket here the question of UFOs as beyond my expertise, but could not resist showing this image. The idea that the luminous object was a natural phenomenon had preceded Hirose's investigations. It was raised in a 1915 essay by Yamakawa Chiyo, a disciple of Tanaka Chingaku, who also held a doctorate in religious studies from Tokyo Imperial University, it was at that time. In defending the historicity of the Tatsunokuchi incident against its critics, Yamakawa was prompted to address the category of miracles, kiseki. This, by the way, is a largely modern term popularized by a growing awareness of Christian teachings. And Yamakawa wrote, some say that the luminous object that appears at the time of the Tatsunokuchi persecution was invented by later persons. Excuse me. But truly, what is so uncanny about this event? There are all sorts of celestial occurrences. It has the character of possibility. Whether by chance or by necessity, it occurred just when Nichiren was about to be beheaded. Naturalistic explanations for seemingly miraculous events related in religious scriptures are, of course, not limited to the Tatsunokuchi persecution. They have been posited to account for miracles in the Hebrew Bible. For example, the parting of the Red Sea, which allowed the Israelites to escape Pharaoh's army, has been attributed to unusual geological activity following the eruption of Thera, now Santorini, in the Aegean Sea, or to rare storm force winds funneled down the Gulf of Aqaba or the Gulf of Suez, causing the water to retreat. As the biblical scholar Mark Harris has observed, some such arguments seem almost as implausible as the events they purport to explain. Conditions under which storm winds could part the Red Sea are thought to occur only once in 1,000 to 3,000 years. By contrast, the shining sphere appearing at Tatsunokuchi seems almost routine. The Bakufu record, Azuma Kagami, or Mirror of the East, contains no fewer than 13 references to luminous objects, hikarimono, observed in the Kamakura area between 1184 and 1256, suggesting that the region was particularly prone to such occurrences. My concern here is not the plausibility of naturalistic accounts for the shining object said to have saved Nichiren's life, but the hermeneutic shift that occurs when they are invoked. As Harris observes, once a natural cause is assumed, the miracle is no longer the event itself, but its timing. This shift is already evident in Yamakawa's explanation. The miraculous happening was not the luminous orb, which he suggests was an astronomical phenomenon, but rather its appearing just at the moment when Nichiren was about to be beheaded. Miracles in the West have often been understood as divine interventions, temporarily suspending the normal order of things, following David Hume's classic definition of a miracle as a transgression of natural law. Some scholars have argued that Buddhism, strictly speaking, does not have miracles in this sense. And although I used the word miraculous for convenience in today's talk title, I'd have to agree. Buddhism has no all-powerful God who could intervene to suspend natural laws. Rather, wondrous events have been explained as especially vivid expressions of principles thought to be continuously at work in the world, such as karmic causality, or the mechanism of stimulus and response that I mentioned earlier, the idea that Buddhas, bodhisattvas, deities, and the cosmos itself respond to human action. Nonetheless, these Buddhist explanations share with traditional Western understandings of miracles the assumption of an underlying ontological and moral order that is absent from modern secular or materialist understandings. By shifting the miracle from the event to its timing, naturalistic explanations bring it into the realm of coincidence, which, depending upon one's hermeneutical position, could mean anything, anywhere, along a spectrum from chance to necessity, to use Yamakawa's terms. The dazzling spherical object said to have saved Nichiren from beheading could have been a cosmic response manifested to save the life of a religious hero or a purely random occurrence. Being independent of religious or moral meaning, naturalistic explanations open a space within which traditional accounts can be accommodated without sacrificing modern norms of rationality and critical thinking. While I'll skip examples in the interest of time, it's significant, I think, that in several recent Nichiren biographies or other treatments, scholars skeptical of the Tatsuno-Kuchi story and those who defend it, literally, both seem compelled to mention that the shining object might have been some sort of natural phenomenon. Whether to cover one's bases or to add an extra layer of legitimacy, acknowledging that possibility shows the writer to be in step with science as the dominant explanatory framework and legitimizing discourse of our times. Indeed, it would likely be difficult for contemporary readers, this one included, whatever their interpretive stance, to hear the luminous object at Tatsuno-Kuchi explained as an astronomical event and not conclude that it could perhaps have had some factual basis. However, it's important to recognize, I believe, that in that very response, we make a hermeneutical move quite foreign to how such an event would have been understood in Nichiren's time. Medieval Japan was a mantic culture concerned with the interpreting of signs, dreams, changes in weather patterns, the appearance of rare animals, strange astral phenomena, all were freighted with meaning. Coincidence was not invoked to explain anomalous events. In fact, On Various Deeds recounts how, following the aborted execution, shogunal officials immediately summoned a yin-yang master to divine its meaning. Even more troubling from a historical standpoint is how broader efforts to explain, sideline, or even dismiss this incident in a manner aligned with modern rationalism have glossed over its significance, whatever its factual status may be, its significance for Nichiren and for his subsequent tradition. In my remaining time, I'd like to touch on how the story of Nichiren's wondrous escape from death has worked as myth. Myth that is in the sense not of falsehood or fabrication, but of a narrative that organizes meaning within the world and makes sense of one's place and that of one's community within it. First, the Tatsuno-Kuchi persecution marked a radical shift in Nichiren's teaching. I won't read this whole passage, but here he says that his earlier teachings were merely preparatory. Like those sutras the Buddha had preached before the lotus, only after the failed beheading did he reveal the full truth to his followers. The content of that full truth is too much to cover here, but in essence, Nichiren began to explain the practice that he advocated, chanting the Daimoku or title of the Lotus Sutra, not merely as a mode of gradual cultivation leading to Buddhahood as a future goal, but as perfectly encompassing all the Buddha's past practices and resulting virtues and affording direct access to the whole of the Buddha's enlightenment in the very act of chanting. That is, after Tatsunokuchi, chanting Nam-myoho Renge-kyo becomes the practice for realizing Buddhahood with this very body, Sokushinjobutsu, as an ordinary person. In effect, practice and enlightenment shift places and are no longer sequential but simultaneous. Enlightenment becomes not the aim of practice, but its ground, while practice becomes not an instrumental means to enlightenment, but its expression. This reversal is linked to another inversion in Nichiren's post-Tatsunokuchi teachings, in which the present Mappo era, conventionally deemed degenerate and evil, is revalorized as the most auspicious time to be living, because now is when the Lotus Sutra's teaching of immediate Buddhahood shall spread. Accompanying this doctrinal shift was a heightened sense of mission on Nichiren's part. At one point in the Lotus Sutra's narrative, in response to the Buddha's call, a throng of incomparably noble bodhisattvas spring up from beneath the earth and receive the Buddha's mandate to spread the sutra in a latter age after his passing. At their head is a bodhisattva called superior conduct, Jogyo in Japanese. From the time of the failed execution, Nichiren began increasingly to speak of his activities as the work of this bodhisattva, and his later tradition explicitly identifies him as superior conduct. In traditional Nichiren Buddhist doctrine, the Tatsunokuchi persecution is thus a decisive event, dividing Nichiren's life into a before and after, and awakening him to a new sense of his religious mission. The account given in various deeds has also provided a template or script for how Lotus devotees should conduct themselves in the face of opposition, especially persecution by the state. The Lotus Sutra itself speaks of tribulations that will confront those who propagate it in an evil latter age. At another point in its narrative, a group of bodhisattvas pledge themselves to this task and predict that, quote, ignorant men will attack us with swords and staves. We will be slandered to kings and ministers and banished repeatedly. We do not begrudge bodily life. We value only the unsurpassed way. Nichiren saw his own trials, both as fulfilling the Lotus Sutra's prophecies and as legitimizing his chosen path. Meeting hostility in the course of proselytizing takes on a salvific value in his teaching. Nichiren Buddhism, in fact, has a history of martyrs, devotees who have at times been exiled, imprisoned, tortured, or even executed for their faith. At such junctures, Nichiren's account in the various deeds has served as an encouragement to stand fast. Several passages, such as this one, stress that when the Lotus Sutra is under threat, giving one's life to defend it is a supremely joyful and meritorious act. Again, I won't read this whole passage, but you can see how in one of Nichiren's graphic metaphors, he says that offering your life for the Lotus Sutra is like exchanging ordinary rocks for gold or dung for rice. This passage and others like it are cited repeatedly as ideals of conduct in the work of later followers confronting similar ordeals. In the modern period, Nichiren's stance as depicted in various deeds has also inspired persons outside the Nichiren sect who were persecuted for divergent views, such as Christians, socialists, and opponents of militant imperialism. At the same time, the element of Nichiren's miraculous escape speaks to a recurring theme in Nichiren Buddhist thought, that the power of the Dharma or Buddhist truth transcends and must ultimately triumph over the raw exercise of worldly power. These are some of the ways in which the Tatsunokuchi narrative has been woven into the identity of Nichiren and his later tradition. The story also has another, perhaps less obvious significance, one that returns us to the subject of miracles. It's true that Buddhism has no omnipotent deity who could intervene to suspend the natural order. However, that does not mean that Buddhism denies metaphysics. It has a metaphysics, not of substance, no absolute God or eternal souls, but a metaphysics of principles, that events arise and cease in accordance with causes and conditions, that all beings are radically interconnected, and that the external world responds to human action, especially religious action. Without that metaphysical ground, notions of ritual efficacy collapse, and Buddhist practice becomes a purely psychological exercise. Some forms of Buddhist modernism have indeed moved in that direction. The account of the shining object that saved Nichiren from beheading clearly offends the sensibilities of some modern exegetes, including some Nichiren Buddhists, who have found it necessary to elide it or account for it in scientific-sounding terms. However, Nichiren himself embraced the traditional Mahayana metaphysics of non-duality, karmic causality, and stimulus response. His conviction that this world could become an ideal Buddha land rests upon it. The narrative of the sudden appearance of the luminous object at Tatsunokuchi, forestalling his execution, illustrates that non-dual interactive potential in especially dramatic fashion. I'm not arguing here for preserving a traditionalist reading. To survive, religions have to change and evolve new ways to convey their teachings and legitimize their claims. But for the historian of religion, it is vital, I believe, to be conscious of that process, to recognize what changes, what is gained or lost thereby, and to make it explicit. As I've tried to illustrate with the case of the medieval Buddhist priest Nichiren's extraordinary escape from death, there are methodological limits to analyzing such accounts in terms of the binary of whether or not they really happened. The narrative of the Tatsunokuchi persecution belongs to a realm where no clear or certain boundary can be drawn between authentic and apocryphal texts, between fact and legend, between the human Nichiren and his mythic image. Only in acknowledging that dimension does the story's full significance for the Nichiren tradition begin to emerge. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.